Hello, and welcome to the Record of Arms. I'm your host, Mark Seven, and as always, I'm glad to have you with me today for another discussion of military history. Today we're going to continue with our story of the wartime career of the Brewster Buffalo fighter. We left off a while ago with the story of the remarkable Finnish unit equipped with an export variant of the Buffalo, Model 239, and their struggle against the Soviets during the Continuation War. We left the squadron, LeLv-24, which had been recently redesignated LeLv-24, in mid-1942, and we'll take up the story there. As always, the sources I'm using for this one can be found in the description for this episode, as well as a link to my Patreon, if you like what I do here and wouldn't mind kicking in a buck or two. That being said, let's get back into it. After the battles with the Hurricanes in the early months of 1942, aerial activity over the Finnish-Soviet front in the area of the lakes and the Olnets Isthmus began to slacken. By the middle months of that year, little action took place in this sector. This was not a sign of Russian inactivity, however. In fact, a buildup was occurring in the southern portion of the Finnish sector, centered on the Soviet fleet based at Kronstadt, on the shores of the Gulf of Finland. Here, the Russians had a strong contingent of naval aviation under the command of the Red Banner Baltic Fleet. This included 3 regiments of bomber aircraft, with a total of 60 bombers. These were supported by a fighter brigade consisting of 5 fighter regiments, with an overall strength of 90 fighters. Like the nearby city of Leningrad, Kronstadt was besieged by the Axis forces, and the object of the Russian concentration was to support efforts to break these sieges and to cover the operations of submarine and surface forces. As a result, the Brewster 239 equipped squadron LeLv-24, one of the Finns' most formidable units, was transferred to the Karelian front to oppose the Baltic Fleet aviation. On the 1st of August, most of the squadron's aircraft had made the move to their new base at Rompoti on the Karelian Isthmus. The next week, they were joined by the first flight, which was previously based at Suurjärvi. At the time of LeLv-24's transfer, the squadron's record in battle during the Continuation War was extremely impressive. Finnish pilots in the Brewster 239 fighter were credited with 227 aerial victories for the loss of 8 of their own planes. 1 Brewster was lost to ground fire, and another crashed while participating in a bombing raid, leaving 6 losses in aerial combat. This works out to a kill-to-loss ratio of almost 38-1, the highest of any fighter in the Second World War. The limitations on the Finnish early warning system frustrated LeLv-24's attempts to intercept Soviet formations over the Gulf. Though they flew frequent missions in support of surface vessels and the submarines of the Baltic Fleet, the Russian planes avoided areas where the Brewster fighters were likely to be encountered. The Russians were flying from bases in the Koivisto-Siaskari area and generally remained south of the latter island. The lag time in the ground observer system and the distance involved made it difficult for Finnish fighters to make an interception. By the middle of the month, tactics were changed in response, and the Finns took the initiative, keeping patrols in the air at likely places at likely times to be able to ambush the incoming Russian. This new approach was successful in bringing about confrontation, and 4 big clashes took place in the middle of August. One of these, on the 18th, was the largest air combat of the Continuation War up to that point. Shortly after 2,000 hours, the squadron received reports of a Soviet formation of about 10 I-16 fighters flying eastwards over Taitarsaari. First Lieutenant Hans Wind led a group of 8 Brewsters to Siaskari, anticipating that the Russians would have to pass by there. Instead, they were ambushed by a much larger group of Russian fighters, both I-16s and some that could have been Hurricanes or Lag-3s, estimated to number at least 60. 2 more sections of Brewsters, led by Captain Karhunen and First Lieutenant Aulis Lum, respectively, were scrambled to assist Wind's fighters. Before long, a total of 16 of LeLv-24's fighters were in combat with the Russians. Captain Karhunen, one of the flight leaders, describes the resulting battle. Quote, "After receiving word that Lieutenant Wind's flight had been bounced, I scrambled with my swarm and headed for Siaskari. As we neared the area, I observed 20-plus I-16s flying top cover for 10 patrol boats. Within moments, I was on the tail of an I-16. I hit it with several short bursts, and the fighter started to trail black smoke, which developed into a raging fire. It then dived into the sea. I made a head-on pass at a second fighter minutes later, before going after a third machine that I spotted flying just above the sea. As I pulled up after attacking the latter fighter, 5 more I-16s came after me from above. I fired at one from head-on and hit it directly in the engine. The fighter flick-rolled onto its back and crashed into the sea. The remaining 4 I-16s chased me away to the northeast, where I spotted a solitary PE-2 bomber flying just above the waves. Having shaken off the Soviet fighters, I was free to attack this lone twin-engine bomber, which I shot down in flames into the sea. The 60-plus I-16s were split up into several separate formations, staggered in altitude. Soviet pilots seemed more than prepared for a fight on this occasion. Upon my return to base, I discovered that a single machine gun round had stuck in my starboard aileron. Karelian was credited with 3 kills in this action, bringing his total for the continuation war to 20. He would receive the Mannerheim Cross in recognition 2 weeks later. 2 other LeLv-24 men, Hans Wind and Ilmari Jutalainen, were also credited with triple victories in this action. In all, 16 Soviet planes were brought down in this battle. The Finns lost 2nd Lieutenant Arno Raitio, who was killed at the controls of fighter BW-378. As they were in this battle, pilots of LeLv-24 were outnumbered by the Soviet Navy pilots in their clashes throughout August. However, they had the advantages of expertise honed by frequent combat, as well as that of strategic surprise. The presence of this elite unit over the Gulf of Finland was unexpected. Indeed, the Brewster Model 239 fighter did not even appear in the enemy aircraft recognition guides distributed to the Russian fleet. In all, the Finns were able to down no fewer than 39 Soviet planes in this week of intense combat, and 50 for the month of August as a whole. These losses staggered Baltic Fleet aviation, and the latter part of the month saw very little Russian activity over the Gulf. The lull would last through most of September. Late that month, Russian Navy planes would once again venture out over the Gulf. The Soviet formations were usually centered on a small number of PE-2 or IL-4 twin-engine bombers, sometimes armed as torpedo bombers. The bombers would be escorted by I-16s or Hurricanes, also in small numbers, with occasional mentions of Spitfires in the Finnish reports. These latter were more likely Lag-3s, MiGs, or perhaps Yak-1s. Jutalainen, who tangled with what he reported as a mixed group of MiGs and Spitfires on the 20th of September, said of the British fighter that they were, quote, fast, had a good rate of climb, and were highly maneuverable. At the low altitudes where most of these battles were fought, the light, handy Brewster Model 239 fighter was a good match for the MiGs, Lags, and the Lend-Lease British machines. This advantage was not so great against the older Polikarpov I-16 fighters. Karelian, who ran into well-handled late-model I-16s more than once in October, reports that, quote, the I-16s we encountered preferred to fight us on the deck, where the Russian fighter proved to be far more maneuverable than the Brewster. The Finns continued to down far more planes than they lost, but damage and casualties continued to chip away at the effectiveness of Squadron LeLv-24. Combat attrition, though very minor in view of the squadron's outstanding performance, was complicated by the dwindling supplies of spare parts for their aircraft. These were not likely to become available anytime soon, seeing as the Americans, though not at war with Finland itself, were now in the war against her ally Germany. Efforts were made to adapt the Model 239 to use the Russian M25 radial engine used on the Polikarpov I-15, I-16, and I-153 fighters. The M25 was in fact a license-built version of the Wright Cyclone R-1820 used in the Buffalo. This and other expedients were of limited utility. The cumulative effect of wear and tear and battle damage was making it harder and harder to keep the Brewsters in the air. Despite these difficulties, the pilots of LeLv-24 were in frequent action over the Gulf and Karelia throughout the month of October. At one of the last clashes of this month, high-scoring ace Captain Aino Lukanen flew his last mission in the Brewster, at the controls of his usual mount, fighter BW-393. On the 30th, he led 8 239s from the squadron's first flight against 8 I-16s protecting a single PE-2 bomber near Oranienbaum. His action report gives the flavor of these late 1942 battles. Quote, I observed 8 I-16s at a height of 1,000 meters. My wingman and I were leading a second pair of Brewsters that were some 400 meters above us, and the latter swarm immediately attempted to attack the I-16s. However, neither formation could gain a height advantage over the I-16s, so we had to break off our pursuit and concentrate on attaining more altitude. As we climbed to 3,500 meters, so the I-16s tried to match us. They eventually reached 3,400 meters astern of us. By then the Soviet machines were above Lake Har-Javelonjarvi, and my swarm attacked the aircraft from the south out of the sun as they were flying in a large defensive circle. The latter had a width of about a kilometer and was about 100 meters below us. During the engagement, I fired at 3 I-16s, one of which went down in a vertical dive, trailing smoke from its fuselage. I was then set upon by other fighters, which forced me to dive near vertically down to a height of about 1,000 meters. When I pulled out, I saw 2 Spitfires and a PE-2 below me. I attacked one of the Spitfires from the rear. It crashed into the forest and exploded. Sergeant Paavo Tolonen did not return from this mission, and his disappearance was not observed by anyone. In addition to the 8 I-16s that we had initially attacked, there were 4 more below them. I saw 4 Polikarpov fighters crash into the forest, including the I-16 that I had shot down. On the 15th of November, 3 flights of LeLv-24, the 1st, 3rd, and 4th, were transferred to the airfield of Sulejarvi on the Karelian Isthmus. This had been captured by the Soviets in the Winter War. Once in possession, they expanded the field and upgraded its facilities. In the Axis advance that opened the continuation war, Mannerheim's army of Karelia took the newly improved field back virtually intact. At the end of the month, the 5 remaining planes of the second flight would join the other 3 at the new base. This would be the first time the entire squadron had been based in a single field since the beginning of the continuation war. The change in the base of operations did not come with a change in the squadron's area of responsibility, which remained Western Karelia and the eastern portions of the Gulf of Finland. The remainder of November was relatively quiet for LeLv-24, which was employed mainly on reconnaissance and bomber escort duties. The exception was a 2-day period of the 22nd and 23rd, when the squadron fought fierce engagements that would prefigure the coming phase of the air war in the far north, when more modern Russian aircraft finally began to replace the Polikarpov fighters in this theater. One of these was the beginning of a line of high-performance fighters created by the Yakovlev Design Bureau, the Yak-1. The Yak-1 was a fast and maneuverable single-engine aircraft introduced in 1940, with wooden wings and a steel tube fuselage covered with plywood. Its form resembled the Spitfire in profile and in front view, and it was often mistaken for the British fighter by enemy pilots, including perhaps by Lukanen in the October battle mentioned before. However, the wings were tapered with straight leading and trailing edges, rather than sharing the famous elliptical planform of the Supermarine fighter. It did share one of the drawbacks of the British machine. Its liquid-cooled V12 Klimov engine could not handle negative G-forces, and would cut out if the nose was dropped sharply. The Yak was intended to complement the MiG fighters, which were optimized for the high-altitude interception mission. The Yak, on the other hand, was built for combat at low altitude, for the primary mission of escorting Soviet bombers and ground attack planes on tactical missions over the battlefield. Below 4,000 meters, or 13,000 feet, it was the most formidable Russian fighter in 1941, able to outturn the MiG and with a cannon armament that was more useful in the ground strafing role. It was also superior to the Lag, which is also at its best in low altitudes. It did not have the drawback of the latter's all-wood construction, which made it heavier than a metal structure and subject to warping and deterioration due to weather. The armament of the early models of the Yak the Finns were encountering consisted of 2 7.62mm machine guns in the nose and a 20mm automatic cannon firing through the cylinder banks of the engine. The 20mm weapon was slower firing, but had a greater range and hitting power than the 50 caliber machine guns of the Brewster fighters. Some Yaks had the 2 machine guns removed to save weight, and these lighter, more agile, cannon-armed only Yaks proved popular with experienced Russian pilots. Yak-1s were in service at the outset of Barbarossa, and nearly all were destroyed in the initial assault. They were widely deployed subsequently against the Axis forces all along the Eastern Front, but the pressures of the war delayed their appearance in significant numbers in the relatively static and quiet sector facing the Finns. Against contemporary models of the German Messerschmitt 109, the Yak was slightly outmatched. Against the Brewster 239, a well-handled Yak was in most cases the superior fighting machine. The November combats began with an engagement between 5 Brewsters of the 4th Flight led by First Lieutenant Alice Lum, and a flight of 6 Yaks, at least one IL-2 Stormovik ground attack plane in the vicinity of Kronstadt. In this action, the Yaks were misidentified by the Finns as American Lend-Lease P-40 Tomahawks. 3 of the Yaks and an Il-2 fell to the guns of the Finnish pilots. Stormovik and one of the Yaks were the victims of First Lieutenant Erik Teroma, who describes his part in the action thus, quote, "I fired at the Il-2 from behind and above until it began to smoke heavily. Its engine must have then quit, as the pilot made a forced landing. At the same time, a Tomahawk latched onto my tail and shot several holes in my airplane. I eventually lost my attacker by pulling up into the solid overcast that blanketed the area. Coming back out of the clouds, I spotted another Tomahawk directly below me, which I fired at while turning in behind it. The aircraft dropped its wing and dived vertically into the sea. Following this engagement, I can confirm that the Tomahawk is faster and more agile than the Brewster. Unlike the other Russian types I have met in the past, these machines stuck around and tried to fight us. Indeed, the Tomahawk pilot who bounced me remained glued to my tail despite my best efforts to shake him. LeLv's flight fought again in the same area several hours later, shooting down an Il-4 bomber carrying a torpedo and 3 more fighters. Both LeLv and Teroma would pass the 5-kill mark on this day and become aces. The next day, elements of the squadron fought 3 separate actions in a short span of time in the general area of Kronstadt. The first saw LeLv's 4th flight tangle with a group of 4 PE-2 bombers escorted by 6 Yaks. The Finns shot down 2 of the bombers and one of the escorts for no loss. Captain Karhunen, an element of the 3rd flight, ran into 6 Yaks near the scene of this battle a little later and claimed one of the enemy machines destroyed. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Hans Wind in the 1st flight engaged a formation of PE-2s and Yakovlev Yak medium bombers, escorted this time by I-16s. He describes this clash thus, quote, "I got in behind an I-16 and shot it down, the fighter crashing heavily on the shoreline. Both of its wings were broken off and the fuselage came to rest upside down. Having witnessed this fighter's demise, I went after 3 PE-2s and a YER-2. I shot one of the PE-2s down into the sea, the aircraft quickly sinking. I fired 4 bursts at a second PE-2, which fell away in a shallow glide towards Kronstadt. My fighter was then targeted by fierce flak, and this prevented me from confirming whether this aircraft did indeed crash. I fired at the YER-2's fuselage from a distance of about 300 meters without effect. The YER-2 is as fast as the PE-2, despite it appearing to be larger. Its wings were markedly bent. Despite these victories, combat and operational attrition took its toll on LeLv-24, and without replacements, its aircraft numbers declined. By the end of 1942, 1 flight of the squadron was disbanded to keep the remaining 3 at a strength of 8 planes apiece. The squadron remained under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Gustav Magnusson, with the 1st flight under Captain Jorma Sarvanto, the 2nd flight led by Lieutenant Ika Toronen, and the 3rd by Captain Karhunen. Little significant combat took place during the winter months. The unit's first major action of 1943 occurred on the 23rd of February, when 6 fighters from Karhunen's flight attacked 4 PE-2s guarded by a dozen I-16s south of Lavansari. In this hard-fought action, the Russians managed to keep the Finns away from the bombers, but at the cost of half of their own number. 2 of the I-16s fell to the guns of Warrant Officer Eero Kinnunen. Another major action took place on the 10th of March, between the 8 Brewsters of the 2nd flight and a force of 7 PE-2s escorted by 10 lags in the area of Haapasari. The Russian formation abandoned their mission and fled for home when the Finnish fighters appeared. During the subsequent pursuit across the Gulf, 1 of the bombers and 6 of the lags were shot down. The Finns were forced to break off their pursuit as the Russians neared Oranienbaum, where their flak batteries threw up a tremendous barrage. April saw a major increase in Soviet air activity over the Gulf and Karelia, and one which was accompanied by a noticeable improvement in both the aircraft and the tactics they employed. New Soviet bases were built, including one at CS Kari, and others expanded to host a new generation of high-performance fighters and bombers. The Il-2s and PE-2s, which made up the bulk of the attack aircraft, were given more effective fighter protection. Older, highly maneuverable I-153 biplane fighters were used along with lags and Yaks to cover these bombers, deployed in complementary groups and staggered at different altitudes. In addition, the Russians began to fly fighter sweeps from their Kronstadt and Krasnaya Gorka bases to keep LeLv-24 busy and draw them away from the bomber formation. Among the Soviet fighters employed were the newer Lavochkin LA-5s and an improved model of the Yakovlev fighter, the Yak-7. All this indicated a much more challenging environment for the Brewster squadron in the months to come. And that, I think, is a good place to end this episode. I hope you found some of what I had to say here interesting or useful, and I hope you'll join me for the next episode of this series, which hopefully won't take so long to appear. Thanks again for watching, and as always, I remain Mark 7, wishing you all the best.